Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. The 18th plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination, is called to order. The conference will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9, Cluster 5, Articles 7 to 10. Since this is a first reading of the proposed text proposed for this conference, I want to remind delegations to indicate their desire to speak by pressing the microphone request button. We still have a few speakers left from this morning's session. In fact, we have 8. Starting with the Holy See, then Chile, Liechtenstein, Vietnam, Algeria, Ecuador, Mexico, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. First of all, I give the floor to the Holy See.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My delegation would like to comment Article 8. Bearing in mind the very severe humanitarian consequences of nuclear explosions, my delegation considers that Article 8 is of great importance. This is why we need to focus particular and serious attention on this, due to this is directly related to the issue of assisting victims and cleaning up the environment. My delegation would like to recall that Article 8 should be considered in close coordination with Articles 6 and 13. To be absolutely clear, we'd like to propose 2 amendments regarding the fund of voluntary contributions to support assistance to victims and cleaning up the environment. Bearing in mind the difficulties of smaller states in providing this assistance by themselves, my delegation wishes to change the title of Article 8 from International Cooperation to International Cooperation and Assistance.
Alors,
So, we'd replace the current title International Cooperation with International Cooperation and Assistance. Furthermore, as we've already proposed under Article 6, we suggest moving paragraph 3 from Article 6 and to insert it as a third paragraph in Article 8, to have a clearer and more coherent article. On this point, the establishment of a fund for voluntary contributions to support the assistance to victims and the clearing up of the environment of the states affected could be considered in the conventional framework of the convention in order to strengthen the links of brotherhood, or fraternal links, and links of solidarity among nations. On this point, as some delegations have advocated for the responsibility of nuclear weapon possessing states, the responsibility for damages due to the use and testing of nuclear weapons. My delegation thinks that these states that bear responsibility should be called upon to contribute to this fund. We should also bear in mind, however, that it will be the victims who have paid and will continue to pay the heaviest price of the consequence of the use and the testing of nuclear weapons. The main beneficiaries of this kind of fund should be the citizen of the countries affected, and the states affected should receive assistance for the public services that benefit the victims and for specific projects to clean up the consequences, environmental consequences. This kind of fund could also support the goals of education for peace, as has been underscored by several delegations. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you very much to the delegation of the Holy See. The delegation of Chile, followed by Liechtenstein, has the floor. Delegation of Chile. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a few brief comments regarding these articles. We would like to associate ourselves with the distinguished delegate of Egypt who has proposed adding paragraph 3 in Article 7 to indicate that the state's parties shall submit biennial implementation reports to the meeting of the state's parties. Now, regarding para 2, we listened very carefully the arguments against and in favor of maintaining the reference of the imposition of penal sanctions against those who undertake activities prohibited by the convention. We would like to underscore that this kind of provision is often can be found in disarmament instruments, and the fact is that since we're looking at a weapons system which is absolutely incompatible and contrary to international humanitarian law, it is illegal. In fact, we believe that the weight of criminal sanctions against those who develop these kinds of weapons that are contrary to the interests of humankind, I think lends weight and credibility to this convention. But we would like to add something else. The fact that this convention is to be incorporated into an international architecture of disarmament, that this convention, as the text indicates, is not at all meant to be at the expense of other instruments such as non-proliferation treaty, but rather as a complement. So I believe that, bearing all that in mind, to add the deterrence or the threat of penal sanctions in a kind of indirect way contributes to this international architecture of disarmament, because whoever conducts activities that contribute to developing, acquiring, using, stockpiling, transferring, or etc. nuclear weapons, well, this provision, this rule will obviously be important and will contribute to international security. We agree with the proposal of Uganda to move Article 8 one article up so that it would follow Article 6. We also agree with a number of delegations that have made interesting comments on this article, in that the implementation of the obligations under the convention is an obligation for which it's also important to add an aspect of international cooperation. So in other words, not cooperation and assistance for everything that has to do with victims, but also for the purpose of implementing the convention itself. And I want to just recall that this provision, this obligation of international cooperation and the responsibility to cooperate, as we say in our Chilean foreign policy, it's something that is also enshrined in other disarmament instruments. Now, as far as Article 9, you will recall, Madam Chair, that the delegation of Chile from the very start stated that it sees this convention as a kind of a political construct that will launch a process. In other words, it's a convention that will kind of snowball in its consequences through the process of review and through the process of enhancing the understanding of its provisions, as what happened in the process of review of the Convention on Biological Weapons. The Convention on Biological Weapons is rather brief, but the Conference of the States Parties made it possible to enrich its provisions through implementation of that convention. So we believe that this article is extremely important. It is perhaps one of the most important articles in this convention. And there have been some proposals aimed at limiting the number of meetings of states parties or having them less frequently. Well, we would be in favor of having a review and monitoring mechanism that is powerful, that is effective, because this is precisely the mechanism through which we will deepen and enrich the understanding of the convention through implementation and provide greater assistance to implementation. So we agree with the excellent proposal made by Ecuador in that have meetings of states parties every 2 years and review conferences every 6 years. It could also be every 4 years to sort of have the same even numbers in 4 years each, so they would alternate every 2 years. We also agree with the suggestion of Colombia and also the proposal of New Zealand, of course, that the rules of procedure that we are applying in this conference should be the rules of procedure that will apply to the meetings of states parties and the review conferences. It is very important, Madam Chair, that we establish a clear dividing line between this political effort that we're carrying out at this conference and the machinery of disarmament. In other words, I don't like to use this kind of language, but I believe that maintaining that difference, if for example, we would consider establishing red lines in our foreign policy, this would be one of them. And I want to take this opportunity to say that the hope that this delegation has in that we will effectively complete the negotiating work before the 8th of July is based on the fact that the rules of procedure of this conference are not, thank God, are not the rules of the machinery of disarmament. Now, regarding the cost, I would invite delegations that have any doubts on this topic to consider the contribution to the costs of these conferences and, generally speaking, contributions to the implementation of this convention as a demonstration of multilateral leadership. In other words, the effort that we are making has to be supported by the political determination to actually carry it forward, to give it concrete manifestation. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine. But I mean, I think that this we need to have this demonstration of leadership. And I think the text that you have circulated, Madam Chair, is a very reasonable text, as one delegation mentioned. In terms of establishing support structures, it's a fairly light text. I mean, we're not creating a executive secretariat for the convention and so forth. And I am sure that our friends from the Office of Disarmament Affairs, I hope that it will soon become a department of Disarmament Affairs, will be able to provide us support based on the in line with the excellent professional standards that they always demonstrate. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the delegation of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President, and good afternoon. We have comments on the current drafting of Article 8, subparagraph 2 speaks of the right to seek and receive assistance, and we would suggest that when we look at that language, that we maintain consistency in the way this is formulated with Article 6.2, where we speak of the right to request and receive assistance. I'm aware that a lot of proposals on this article have been made, and there might be redrafting and reshuffling going on at the next stage, but we would be grateful if the consistency of language could be kept in mind. Also, I mentioned it in my previous intervention, we would like to suggest to the room, if it is not useful, to include at the end of Article 8, subparagraph 2, a reference to Article 6. For example, it could read, including with regards to the provisions contained in Article 6. We do recognize that there is a difference in scope between Article 8 and Article 6, but we believe the way that we propose this reference very much takes into account that difference. On Article 9, the meeting of states parties, I'm lucky that I'm speaking after the distinguished ambassador of Chile, who has very eloquently put to the floor why this is a crucial article in the text, and I fully share his assessment. We do need strong and clear provisions in this article, as the meeting of states parties will be the key political forum to advance the purpose of this treaty. We think we have a very good basis with your draft to do that, and we would like to reinforce it at some points. I recognize that some delegations have referred to the role that the meeting of states parties will have to, at its constituent meeting to decide on some matters itself, but I think it is very well in the purview of this treaty to give guidance on substantive elements that should be discussed within the meeting of states parties. In that spirit, we have a couple of comments on paragraph 1. Like others, subparagraph B, we have found that it was unclear what the term reports by states parties refers to, and it's been mentioned by other delegations. From our point of view, unless it is specified somewhere in the treaty, we would question its introduction here, or at least the way that it is framed. At the same time, we believe the meeting of states parties should have a role to deal with questions regarding compliance with the treaty, and we would therefore propose the introduction of a subparagraph B bis, which would address this issue, and it would read B bis, situations of non-compliance, partial compliance or violations of treaty obligations, and measures to address these. This is just a proposal, and we're flexible to discuss with other delegations the wording of this, but we think the substantive element should be in this text. After subparagraph D, We also have a proposal for 2 additional elements to be included in the substantive issues to be discussed by the meeting of states parties. D bis, our proposal would be to introduce requests for assistance in accordance with Article 6 and 8, so that the meeting of states parties can actually take up and react to such requests when they are put forward. And D ter, contribution to the settlement of disputes in accordance with Article 12. When we later come to the Article 12, as it is currently drafted, it foresees a role for the meeting of states parties to settle disputes, so we feel it's useful to include it also here in this text. On subparagraph 2, we would propose the addition at the very end of the paragraph of the following phrase, or required by a notification of withdrawal. The purpose of this proposal is that should states parties to this treaty or convention be notified by the withdrawal of a state from the treaty, we feel that it is a serious matter of concern to other states parties, and it should be discussed in the framework of a meeting of states parties. Subparagraph 3, we support those delegations who have proposed stronger language in the second line, namely to replace the word may by something more stringent, and I think Ireland proposed it and supported by others also. We would support to have formulation with shall. On the second half of this paragraph, starting with a view to ensuring, we have asked ourselves what the added value of this provision is, and if it's not maybe more straightforward to delete that, since we do not seem to lose anything in substance in this paragraph. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Liechtenstein. I give now the floor to delegation of Vietnam, followed by Algeria, Ecuador, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, RCRC. Delegation of Vietnam has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation, of course, lies itself with the statement made this morning by myself on behalf of the ASEAN. I'm speaking now on in my national capacity. And on Article 9, under 1D, we support Cuban proposal to add within agreed time frame. We also share the view of Switzerland about the usefulness of the possibility of special meeting of state parties, and this usefulness could be used not only to consider the participation of nuclear weapon state, but also to discuss urgent needs or requests of assistance. We also noticed that we have similar view like Switzerland regarding the subpara D, because the language here is almost identical to that of the Ottawa Convention and the CCM. And we agreed with the Swiss proposal to add to the end of this subparagraph in accordance with the agreed rules of procedures to be in line with the two mentioned convention. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Vietnam. Now the delegation of Algeria has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My delegation requested the floor in order to make some important remarks on Article 6 at the moment. After listening to many delegations' proposals on this article, likewise, my delegation considers this article is an important section within the text of the draft treaty in order to meet the right of victims and remediate the environment from the use or test of nuclear weapons. As many delegations made reference to nuclear weapon testing in my country, as well as in other countries. My delegations would like to underscore that 7 open-air nuclear tests were conducted on the soil of Algeria in the past. We know the negative impact of such evil weapons, and my country is still assessing the injurious effects on the people and the environment. Therefore, my delegation would like to support other delegations which are calling for robust measures, such as in reflecting further responsibilities of nuclear weapon states, not only through meeting or providing assistance to victims, but also through compensations on all levels. We welcome in this regard some measures of compensations taken by some nuclear weapon states. Nevertheless, we consider that such measures are not enough and should be undertaken and treated globally in an equal manner. In this context, we launch an appeal to all nuclear weapon states to cover with this measure all the people and regions that are still and were affected by the use or testing of such deadly weapons. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias a la delegación.
Many thanks to the delegation of Algeria. I now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, President. Excuse me for once again taking the floor on this cluster. There is a specific issue that I forgot to mention when I first took the floor. This pertains to Article 9, subparagraph 4. Indeed, like other delegations, we would prefer wording which differs from that currently in this paragraph. Here we talk about may be invited. Organisations may be invited. Article 9, paragraph 4. May be invited. Who are you talking about? Who, which session, when? Perhaps this language is not clear enough. It's not the most appropriate wording. Perhaps will be, shall be invited would be more direct and more appropriate language. Of course, you can't leave it to the whim of whoever's presiding over the conference to make those decisions. So perhaps Brazil's proposal, Ireland's proposal in this regard, to use the rules of procedure of our meeting, perhaps that's the most appropriate suggestion. We've got a set of rules in place which govern who should be invited where. Moreover, we have rules which determine how non-governmental organisations are able to participate, how they're given that right. Here we talk about relevant non-governmental organisations, but who are they? Who determines whether they're relevant or not? Are they those with consultative status or not? So perhaps we need to clean up this wording to make it clear who is deciding which organisations can attend. So perhaps we can use the rules of procedures of the conference for future states parties meetings. And this brings me back to the frequency of meetings, that issue. Of course, my delegation is very flexible when it comes to schedules and when we hold our meetings. Nothing's set in stone. Holding review conferences every 5 years is not something that's set in stone. We could hold them every 4 years. That was proposed by my colleague. We could have them every 6 years. That's what I said. But we shouldn't be tied to traditional positions and shouldn't scrupulously follow other conferences' practices. But what we need to understand is what these conferences are doing, the contributions that they're making, and the authority that they have. You need to look at what they're doing, these conferences, to determine how frequently they should be held. And in that connection, I think that if delegations had that information and looked at that information properly, they could decide how frequently our conferences needed to be held. And they could decide if it was worth having review conferences. This brings me to Article 9, subparagraph 3. Indeed, the language meetings of states parties may decide. There's that phrase there. Which meetings are we talking about here? The last before the States Parties Conference, the first of a cycle, etc., etc. Here too, I think it would perhaps more useful to avoid misguided interpretations of the treaty to determine that. Are we talking about a meeting, a review conference, and how, if we are, how often should they be held? I don't think it will be very difficult for us to reach agreement on that point. Now, one last comment. I've heard proposals, I think, on this, and that is special meetings or emergency meetings. On that, we think that this notion, this concept should be included, but of course we would need to determine the conditions or the circumstances under which these emergency meetings would be held. I listened closely to the distinguished delegation of Liechtenstein when he talked about the fact that we should meet when there are notifications of non-compliance of the treaty. We have a proposal which perhaps goes beyond what was proposed by Liechtenstein, but we should look at what the Vienna Convention says here. But whichever text we look at, we should consider the need to have emergency meetings and look at why they would be convened, how and who would be in attendance. Do we have a majority of member states? Do we need 2/3 when we hold these emergency meetings? But in any case, there are precedents, I think, to decide all of these things without much difficulty. Thank you. Many thanks indeed to the delegation of Ecuador. I give the floor to the delegation of Mexico, followed by Nigeria.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Many thanks, President. As regards Article 9, Paragraph 4, we wish to support the proposals made both by Thailand and Ireland. Thailand said, and we agree with this, that we need to add the text civil society, and Ireland said they wanted to change maybe to should be invited, and we agree with those proposals. Now, my delegation does not believe it necessary to create a support unit for implementation, and in that connection, we think it is highly relevant to take up the proposal of New Zealand. The functions of the Secretariat should be something that is reflected in the treaty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks. Mexico?
Floor followed by Indonesia and Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank you so very much. This proposal from Nigeria is without prejudice to the way and manner you have structured your work here in the document. But we just feel most sincerely that what we're about to say, perhaps a few others have highlighted that would further strengthen the work. In the view of my delegation, we believe that notwithstanding what becomes of this Article 8 at the end of the day, it can't stand where it is for two reasons. Number one, we feel, and most sincerely too, that if you look at Article 8.2, we feel it's really not stating anything new when you look at Article 6. But as I said, Madam President, this is without prejudice to the enormous work you have done on it. We only feel that if we remove Article 8.2, the second part of Article 8, but then that leaves us with one part, which we feel will not be right. But the part of the question we'll also want to ask, why did we not take it up to meet its cousin on Article 6? And I also don't know why we can't say, for you to read assistance and international cooperation. Perhaps you will have your reason. And then that will also not fit into a number of proposals, including the one made by the Holy See in the morning regarding to change it to victims assistance and environmental remediation. But then we just feel that the B part of the second part of that article might not really have the strength to stand on its own in view of the fact that we have elaborated more on assistance in Article 6. And then if we can do it, we can also move it up to meet Article 6, and then it would then we can change the formatting. And secondly, we also notice that having talked about assistance in Article 6, then we move on to national implementation. So the aspect of international cooperation could as well go up, and then let us have national implementation down, and for it to read that way. Whatever the title becomes at the end of the day, will be fine with it. So I thank you, Madam President. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Nigeria. I give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to align myself with the interventions made earlier by Vietnam on behalf of ASEAN. and would like to make some additional points in our national capacity. Madam President, we've heard some interventions earlier on the view and also the necessity to merge Article 6 on assistance together with Article 8 on international cooperation. We do find merit to this proposal. We are certainly flexible for this. Nevertheless, we would caution that there needs to be a high degree of consistency when such merge will and do take place, and to make sure that all the flow and as well as the elements corresponds to the flow of the convention. Secondly, Madam Chair, since we are still in Article 8 and we have yet to decide whether we should merge this with Article 6, I'd like to comment briefly on Article 8, Para 1. We feel that this article, as it stands now, is a good paragraph, which seeks state parties to facilitate on the implementation as well as the obligation. My delegation views that perhaps this article could be more proactive rather than passive, because as it stands now, we feel that the word facilitate tends to be more of a passive rather than proactive. So in this respect, we would like to make an additional language to this paragraph 1, Article 8, and this language would follow after facilitate, and it would read, to facilitate and has the right to participate in the implementation of the obligation of this convention, so as to make this paragraph more proactive in terms of us conducting international cooperation. Having said that, this language has been used in previous convention, namely the Convention on the Biological Weapon, Article 10, Paragraph 1, which also states that states do have the right to participate in helping and cooperate each other. Lastly, Madam President, we've heard many rationales and arguments pertaining to Article 9, Paragraph 2 on the necessity to meet following the enter into force of the convention, as well as having the time frame for the review conference. My delegation is certainly flexible on this. There are suggestions to have it 2 to 5 or maybe 2 to 6. Either way, my delegation is fine with this, but we want to stress at this point that there needs to be clarity in terms of what would be the objective of this meeting. We need to sit down together and really rationalize what is the prime intention of this meeting. Since most of us here are non-nuclear weapons, and since most of us here have indeed conducted all our obligations under previous treaties, we need to clarify and we need to be clear to ourselves what is it that we want to discuss and what is the objectives and what is the end game. Initially, we thought about putting some words on the need to do more reaching out, because we need to convince others. We need to talk to the unconverteds on this, because we are already converted on this issue. So we need to reach out to the unconverted on this. And this is probably something that we could possibly slip into Article 13 on universality. But having said that, I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Indonesia. The delegation of Marshall Islands has the floor now, and followed by International Committee of the Red Cross.
Madam President and distinguished colleagues, with their indulgence, we would like to include recommendations to Article 6 as it references to Article 8. Nuclear testing has ravaged the Pacific Islands. In my country, the citizens of Bikini, Enewetak, Ronglap, and Wuturuk, and other atolls were subject to fallout and severe radiation from 67 nuclear tests conducted during its time as a UN trust territory by our administrating authority, the United States of America. It is important to reflect upon the two UN trusteeship resolutions passed in 1954 and 1965, which included assurances from the UN that relevant victims' impacts would be addressed. Due to the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, we were determined that the Convention must provide adequate assistance to all victims of nuclear testings regardless of their jurisdiction. Thus, Article 6 and Article 8 are important articles for the Marshall Islands. We have the following recommendations. 1, the title to change of Article 6 to Victim Assistance and Environmental Remediation. 2, reaffirm that the requirement to provide victim assistance falls within international human rights law and the ability for an affected state alone to address that may be constrained by the affected state's capacity. Assistance should be provided by state parties and through international assistance to any affected victim, regardless of their jurisdiction. Nuclear testing impacts are a unique humanitarian issue, often with transboundary and multilateral character. While any and all of who the capacity to act and assist with addressing affected human rights should do so, it is also inequitable and ineffective to shift the entire burden to do so to states who did not cause such impacts and who may also have limited capacity to address such impacts. This article should not be about assigning responsibility. It should be about addressing affected victims. 3, an affected state should be invited to provide relevant information and should, upon its request, be provided with international assistance with its relevant capacity. 4, add or other nuclear explosive devices from the phrase that respect to individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons. 5, the Marshall Islands strongly supports the current focus of the draft text to adequately provide age and gender-sensitive assistance, including medical care, rehabilitation, and psychological support, as well as provide for their social and economic inclusion. We recommend the inclusion of the phrase without discrimination for after gender-sensitive assistance. 6, draft Article 6, Section 1 should elaborate further on affected state parties' victim assistance obligations. It also should be complemented by an expanded international cooperation and assistance article, draft Article 8, which, among other elements, would explicitly mandate the states parties provide assistance to the victims of nuclear testing regardless of their jurisdiction. This phrase should also be expanded to include assistance with monitoring because it anticipates the need for assistance that responds to the need of victims and acknowledges that these extend beyond the medical or environmental realm. The operative section must not include any affected state parties from the responsibility to provide victim assistance, regardless of the jurisdictional status of those victims. Regarding methods and principles for providing victim assistance, which may be further elaborated by future state parties meetings, the Republic of the Marshall Islands suggests the following to be considered. 1, assistance should be tailored to victims' needs regardless of their jurisdiction, and affected states should be encouraged to assess victims' needs as well as make every effort to collect reliable, relevant data regarding victims within their capacity to do so, and for state parties to provide assistance in this regard. 2, victims of nuclear weapons should be actively involved in the decision-making process that concerns them. Giving guidance on steps to implement victims' assistance and consider facilitative steps for reporting on related implementations, including reducing overlaps with existing human rights reporting process. Concerning implementation steps, they should include guidance and assistance in developing, implementing, and enforcing any necessary national laws and policies, as well as striving to incorporate relevant guidelines and good practices in the delivery of victim assistance, developing approaches for victim assistance, and designating a focal point to coordinate implementation. Thus, we propose the creation of paragraph 1, which would incorporate these views. Article 6, paragraph 2, the Marshall Islands is concerned that this section only allows parties to have the right to request and to receive assistance for environmental remediation, as such rights to request assistance may already exist, rather than providing for effective avenues of assistance from these parties, states, to victims and affected states, irrespective of the jurisdiction or geographic status of these people, nor state parties, status of their parent state, and otherwise taking into account its respective capacity. This section does not mention any need for the public to engage in risk education in order to limit the harm caused by the areas contaminated by the use or testing of nuclear weapons. Given the humanitarian framing of the treaty, this seems like a major oversight. In contrast with the precedent in humanitarian disarmament treaties, the provision does not offer any guidance on how to organize environmental remediation, which could be referenced and also further considered in detail in future state parties meeting, and which should take into account respective capacity and emerging technologies. Such assistance could be addressed in Article 8. In order to clarify Article 6, paragraph 2, we propose the following. Making environmental remediation and monitoring a goal for affected states that have areas of contamination in their jurisdiction or control, in addition to inviting all other states, including state parties, to assist them in meeting this goal, including a goal for affected states to conduct risk reduction, education, and encouraging other states parties to provide assistance for risk reduction education to affected states. Elaborating further on this goal, encouraging guidance and international assistance regarding survey and assessment, risk communication, reporting and enumeration of the specific institutional agreements, including quality standards, national action plans, and resource mobilization. We further recommend that when one state party has specific knowledge related to inter alia types and quantities of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices used or tested, the precise location of the use or testing and known or suspected areas of contamination, that information shall be made available to the affected state to facilitate a remediation of such contamination. To help affected state parties meet their obligations under draft Article 6, the treaty should include a separate article requiring other states to provide international cooperation and assistance. The proposed amendments to drafts Article 6 also include a provision making clear that affected state parties may seek redress through other mechanisms for human and environmental harm attributed to the use or testing of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. In this vein, we recommend the following insertion. Nothing in this article shall include a state party from seeking redress by peaceful means beyond this convention, including existing agreements from states that have used or tested nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices in affected areas under the state party's jurisdiction. Madam President, turning our attention to Article 8, we underscore the necessity for expanded international cooperation in assistant article as procedurally mentioned. We recommend the following. 1, each state in a position to do so shall provide technical, material, and financial assistance to victims affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. 2, each state parties in a position to do so shall provide assistance for the implementation of the obligation referred to Article 6. 3, if after entry into force of the convention, nuclear weapons are used or tested in areas under the jurisdiction or control of a state party, then each state party in a position to do so shall urgently provide emergency assistance to the affected victims. 4, each state party in a position to do so may contribute to relevant trust funds in order to facilitate the provision of assistance under this article. 5, such assistance may be provided inter alia through the UN system, international, regional, or national organizations or institutions, non-governmental organizations or institutions, or on a bilateral basis. We shall provide additional comments in writing. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Marshall Islands and for its contribution, and we will be expecting also to receive them in writing and by email. Now the delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would just like to make a few brief remarks under this cluster of articles on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross. First of all, concerning draft Article 9, Paragraph 4, which lists those with observer status in the meetings of states parties, we recommend to add, after the reference to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, as is done and as appears in Article 11, Paragraph 3 of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, sitting to my left, is the sister organization of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It is the umbrella organization gathering the 190 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies worldwide. And like the ICRC, it has observer status in the UN General Assembly and in various treaty bodies. As a component of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the International Federation has been an integral part of our movement's efforts towards the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, and therefore it is entirely fitting that it be mentioned as an observer and a participant in the meetings of states parties. Next, Madam President, the ICRC wishes to express agreement with those delegations that have proposed an explicit reporting requirement, that is to spell that out explicitly in the draft treaty and not leave this to a meeting of states parties, for discussion in the meeting of states parties. Reporting on measures taken to implement the treaty is a key obligation of treaties prohibiting weapons and is critical for the transparency of the implementation of the treaty. And then finally, Madam President, some have questioned the inclusion in Article 7, Paragraph 2 of an obligation to apply penal sanctions for violations of the treaty's prohibitions. The ICRC wholeheartedly agrees with the many delegations, including very eloquently Chile, that have supported the requirement to provide penal sanctions in national legislation. And these delegations have recalled the long list of precedents set by treaties prohibiting or limiting the use of certain weapons, which require states to implement at national level in their national legislation penal sanctions for violations. And such a provision, we believe, is crucial to ensuring respect for the treaty's prohibitions. Thank you.
I thank the International Committee on the Red Cross. We have exhausted the list of speakers for this cluster. We now can move on to the time that we have allocated for civil society organizations. And I give the floor now to Mr. Carlos Umaña from ICANN.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam, as a Costa Rican citizen, I'm very happy to see you there. Now, to achieve the goals of this treaty, it's important to have national measures of implementation, not only regarding the various prohibitions, but also the positive obligations as well. We believe that it's important to have a stronger and detailed provision on international cooperation, on assistance, and on facilitation of compliance. That provision would be essential, especially for the full implementation of the rights of victims and for cleaning up environment. It's also it will be a very important provision. Assistance could be provided in different forms, including legislative assistance, strengthening institutional arrangements, and material and financial assistance. Also, meetings of states parties will be an important component of the institutional arrangement of the treaty and should be held at least once a year, not only every 2 years. And they need to have the participation of civil society. For ICANN, it was a pleasure to be a partner of civil society in the 3 conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. In the open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament, we also played a very active role. Here, participating in this conference of negotiation, there have been over 100 activists from ICANN campaigns, and we intend to work actively in future years to promote the full implementation and universalization of the prohibition on these weapons. Therefore, it's very important for civil society to be invited to take part in meetings of states parties, not simply to attend these meetings. We welcome the proposal to allow states non-parties to be present as observers in order to encourage their adherence to the treaty. And it's important to have an obligation to issue reports by states parties on measures adopted to implement the treaty. This is a standard characteristic of many similar types of treaties. We believe that the treaty should establish a body that will be in charge of organizing the meetings of states parties, facilitate implementation, develop mechanisms of verification and compliance, and promote universal implementation. Also, it should have a mandate to educate the worldwide public opinion on the importance of the treaty and on the potential disaster of nuclear war. Otherwise, it will be difficult for us to achieve our goal. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Carlos Umaña for ICANN, and thank you for your kind words.
Tony Doherty from Harvard Law School.
Thank you, Madam President. A robust article on international cooperation and assistance is key to the success of the new nuclear weapon ban treaty. It will facilitate measures to address the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons and ensure affected states do not bear the burden, an undue burden, for dealing with this harm. As discussed in an earlier session today, the new treaty should include not only prohibitions, but also positive obligations to respond to the suffering of victims and damage to the environment. Primary responsibility for victim assistance and environmental remediation should rest with affected states for legal and practical reasons. But these countries will most assuredly need outside help to meet their obligations. That support should come from other states parties to the nuclear weapon ban treaty. By requiring international cooperation and assistance, the treaty will help states parties implement their obligations and thus ensure that the treaty's agreed-on goals are achieved. Inclusion of an international cooperation and assistance article will also provide incentives for affected states to join the new treaty. Once they become states parties, they will be entitled to a range of support. While Article 8 of the draft text addresses this topic, it should be strengthened in several ways. The proposed amendments are based on precedent in existing disarmament treaties. First, the article should require states parties to provide assistance as well as cooperation. Although the draft treaty gives states parties the right to seek and receive assistance, according to Article 8, draft Article 8.1, other states parties are only obligated to cooperate. Second, Article 8 should elaborate on the types of assistance states parties should provide and how they should be provided. Because international cooperation and assistance can come in a variety of forms, including technical, material, financial, and human resources, arguably all states would be able to contribute some type of assistance. Third, the article should enumerate areas including victim assistance, environmental remediation, and norm promotion for which international cooperation and assistance is required. Such specificity will help ensure affected states receive outside assistance they need. Strengthening Article 8 in these ways is not only a matter of legal precision, it is also a humanitarian imperative because it will help ensure that the treaty addresses the human and environmental effects of nuclear weapons in a fair and effective manner. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Bonnie Doherty from Harvard Law School. I give the floor to Mr. Alex Glazer from Princeton University.
Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to briefly address this conference. I would like to offer a few thoughts on how Articles 7 through 9 could further strengthen verification of the treaty that we are negotiating and complement the articles we discussed yesterday. Article 8, International Cooperation, currently asks states parties to cooperate with other parties to facilitate the implementation of the obligations of this convention. Here, we believe Article 8 could be explicit and include encouragement for states to cooperate on the further development of the tools needed for disarmament verification. It's a common mistake to assume that only weapon states have the technical resources and the expertise to advance new approaches to nuclear disarmament verification. In fact, the ban offers a unique opportunity to get this process started sooner rather than later. States who wish to act on this opportunity could then bring their suggestions to the meetings of the states parties introduced in Article 9. Now, Article 9, paragraph 1d, calls for the states parties to consider proposals for the verified and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapon programs. This is very important, and we believe this article could also include language to consider provisions for the development of the tools needed to confirm the completeness of declarations which are to be submitted by former nuclear weapon states. As you know, this is one of the most daunting challenges of nuclear disarmament verification, and it's critical for the viability of Articles 2 through 5. We offer some specific suggestions to this effect in a working paper to be submitted later this week. We also think that, as in the CWC, the MSP may want to consider establishing a scientific advisory board and envision temporary working groups of scientific experts to provide guidance and recommendations on specific technical issues. I'd like to conclude by briefly turning to Article 7, National Implementation. Under Article 7, paragraph 1, each state party is required to adopt the necessary measures to implement its obligations under this convention. Again, we believe this article offers an opportunity to strengthen the verification of the treaty by including a whistleblower clause. Any system of nuclear verification would gain enormously from access to information that could be provided by scientists and technicians inside nuclear programs or by ordinary citizens with regard to possible violations of a treaty. Article 7 could therefore include a paragraph to require national laws to be passed by member states to make it a responsibility and duty of every citizen to report prohibited activities and to protect those who do so. This could be a simple, straightforward, and yet very powerful provision to strengthen the verification of the treaty and to sustain a world free of nuclear weapons. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Glazer. I give now the floor to Ms. Sadek Karabulut from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament.
Madam President, members of delegations, Your Excellencies, I take the floor on behalf of the Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. The testimonies of the peoples who have experienced the impact of the use and testing of nuclear bombs have deeply touched me and many other parliamentarians. We are concerned about increasing nuclear threat postures and risk of nuclear weapons being used again, whether by accident, miscalculation, or intent. Nuclear weapons are therefore incompatible with humanity, a clean and sustainable environment, and a safe world for current and future generations. As a member of Dutch Parliament, I plan to be strongly involved in our national implementation efforts, hoping the Netherlands will in the end decide to join the treaty. This would include legal measures to prohibit nuclear weapons, including those stationed in the Netherlands and other NATO countries. We support the inclusion of Article 7 on national implementation of both the positive and negative obligations in the treaty. We encourage state parties to take the necessary action to adopt such national implementation measures without delay upon conclusion of the treaty, and we highlight the importance of cooperating with parliamentarians and civil society in developing and adopting these measures. We should suggest that in implementing the treaty, state parties adopt the strongest and broadest possible measures to prohibit nuclear weapons nationally and to support the global prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. As such, states could go beyond the minimum obligation outlined in the final treaty. You could consider additional measures such as establishing ministerial positions, public advisory committees and/or parliamentary subcommittees on disarmament, as well as disarmament education funds, institutes or other public institutions to further advance the goal of the global elimination of nuclear weapons. It is embarrassing and a disgrace that the pension fund, which holds my retirement money, currently invests in nuclear weapons production. I suggest you could adopt comprehensive measures to end investments in nuclear weapons production. PND also support for a strong and properly financed agency or secretariat, which is provided with a mandate to not only monitor implementation by states parties, but also to promote the global elimination of nuclear weapons. We see merit in the proposal of Ayalana that the treaty could give the Conference of States Parties a role to establish the agency or secretariat. To conclude, we strongly suggest to alter Article 9.4 and invite international organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and non-governmental organizations such as PND and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons to participate and not just attend meeting of state parties. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Karabulut from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And finally, I give the floor to Mr. Joshua Sandoval from the Autonomous University of Baja.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair. From the academic perspective, our goal is to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that leads to their complete elimination. I'd like to say that this treaty, which sets as a goal to prohibit nuclear weapons, it will take time for some countries that are not present in this conference to sign it and to ratify it. There's a risk, a global risk, and all countries of the world are at risk. But immediately it's 43 countries that don't have nuclear weapons that share borders with nuclear weapon states that are most at risk. And these countries might be attacked in case the minimal or maximal deterrence doctrines fail, or if an accident occurs. The 9 states that have nuclear weapons share borders with some 64 states. In addition to already existing treaties such as the NPT and the nuclear free zones, and this treaty, also considering Article 6, 7, 8 of NPT and Article 19 of what will be the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. All this creates an opportunity to move forward with a treaty that protects borders between states, nuclear weapons possessing states and non-nuclear states. This is a strategy to make sure that nuclear weapon states don't have a pretext to continue possessing nuclear weapons and to potentially attack across their borders other states. We have regional treaties on zones free of nuclear weapons, and why can't we have a treaty or amendments or mechanisms that protect border regions? There are 43 countries that do not have nuclear weapons and yet have borders with countries that do have. 64 borders that are shared by the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. I also want to comment on Article 8, international cooperation, where the states parties should facilitate cooperation with other states parties to help them implement the obligations of the convention. It's important to specify here that this cooperation shouldn't be limited in any way. In paragraph 2 on the obligations under the convention, on the fact that states parties have the right to seek and receive assistance, it would be a good idea to specify what kind of assistance here. And regarding Article 9, paragraph 4, regarding organizations as who could be observers, it is true that these organizations, we need to make sure that they participate in the review conferences of this treaty. There needs to be a guarantee and that they participate. And also, I agree with the delegations of Mexico and Ecuador that these words that say perhaps, maybe, should be eliminated. And lastly, in Article 13, the fact that all states parties should help those who are not signatories to sign the treaty. I think it's important to add that incentives should be included for non-party state to encourage them to sign and to ratify the treaty. In conclusion, I want to say that peace is the most rational way to save life, and the only way to do this is to make sure that it's universal. That is why we're all here, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the goal of this treaty is to achieve the prohibition of nuclear weapons and not to convert these negotiations into excessively complex exercises where we get bogged down on each one of the articles. Thank you.
I thank the representatives of civil society for their contributions to this conference. We are now finalizing then the first reading of Articles 7 to 10. And now I invite the conference to consider the final provisions which are contained in Articles 11 to 21. Many of these provisions are standard clauses that appear in most treaties, and therefore the language should be very familiar to all of us. The various options reflected in the final provisions also incorporate the various preferences expressed by states at the March session. In accordance with the standard practice for draft treaties that designate the Secretary General of the United Nations as depositary, the UN Office for Legal Affairs has reviewed the draft text of the final provisions and provided advice and comments to the Presidency. The Secretariat has already posted the suggestions, which are minor and very surgical. They are already posted on the website. But I can say that those comments included a small number of very technical revisions to the draft text. I will very briefly mention which they are, but as I say, the suggestions are already posted on the website. On Article 11 regarding amendments, at the end of the first paragraph, the following text has been added. I quote, "The depositary shall communicate any adopted amendment to all state parties." End of quote. In paragraph 2, the phrase, I quote, "or acceptance," end of quote, should be added after the term acceptance in the 3 places where it appears. On the matter of the adoption of amendments, OLA notes that the draft does not specify how a majority of states parties is to be calculated. When a treaty is silent on this matter, as in this case, the practice of the Secretary General as depositary is to calculate the percentage on the basis of the number of states parties to the Convention at the time of deposit of the instrument of ratification of the amendment, the so-called the moving target approach. If the intention of the negotiating states were to calculate the percentage at the time of the adoption of the amendment, it would be advisable to reflect it in the draft, adding after the word parties the words at the time of adoption. Otherwise, the understanding I just explained will apply. In Article 14, under the title Signature, the word before should be replaced with the word until. The Office for Legal Affairs further advises that a period of at least 4 weeks should be allowed between the date of adoption of the Convention and the date of opening for signature, in order to enable the preparation of the original and the distribution of certified 2 copies to states. In Article 15, entitled Ratification, the title of the article should be amended to add, after the word ratification, the words acceptance, approval, or accession. The words acceptance or approval should be added after ratification. A second sentence should be added, which reads as follows. Following its entry into force, this convention shall be open for accession by any state that has not signed the convention. Regarding Article 18, entitled Duration, in paragraph 2, OLA advises the task of providing a notification to all states parties of a withdrawal as a function of the depositary. Therefore, OLA advises that in the second sentence, the phrase, open quote, all other parties to the convention, end of quote, should be replaced with the words, the depositary. Further, in that same sentence, they advise deletion of the phrase 3 months in advance, as the matter is addressed in the following paragraph. In paragraph 3, OLA advises that in the first line after the phrase 3 months after the, I will repeat, OLA advises that in the first line after the phrase 3 months after the words date of should be added. Toward the end of the second sentence, the word state should be included in front of party, and the phrase annexed protocols should be replaced with additional protocols. OLA also notes that the depositary may not make the determination whether a withdrawing state party is engaged in a situation described in this paragraph, namely an international armed conflict, on the expiry of the 3-month period. Consequently, the matter whether a withdrawing party constitutes to be bound by the obligations of the Convention cannot be settled by the depositary. This concludes the comments received by OLA, which I have already mentioned are already posted on the website. I would also like to make a reference to Article 19, entitled Relations with Other Agreements. As I stated in my remarks at the informal meeting on June 12 here in New York, and in May 22nd in Geneva. The matter of the relationship between the Convention and the NPT is one that requires careful consideration, as it was actually included in the mandate that created this conference. The intent of the draft is to complement and strengthen the NPT as well as other instruments. And it has been the intention of the participating states in the conference so expressed in the March session. Upon further reflection, I believe that Article 19 could be reformulated to better reflect the intent that nothing in this convention shall be interpreted as in any way limiting or detracting from the obligations assumed by any state under the NPT. I look forward to your suggestions on the reformulation of this article. With these explanations and proposals, I open the floor to the delegations wishing to comment on Articles 11 to 21. I give the floor now to the delegation of Malaysia, followed by Indonesia, Cuba, and Egypt.
Thank you, Madam President, for the floor. The member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, namely Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos People's Democratic Republic, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and my own country, Malaysia, will now present our views on the final provisions in Articles 11 to 21. ASEAN is appreciative of the formulation provided by the Chair on Cluster 6. Related to these articles, we would like to highlight the following elements. Firstly, on amendments, ASEAN would like to see provisions to the legally binding instrument that would permit amendments with the support of at least 2/3 of the total number of state parties. Secondly, on entry into force, ASEAN prefers to see a provision that would ensure a reasonable number of ratifications by states, which would allow for early entry into force of the instrument, while reflecting a broad political commitment towards the instrument's universalization. Thirdly, on duration, ASEAN would like to see provisions on state parties' suspension and withdrawal, subject to specific conditions and consistent with Articles 42 and 43 of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Fourthly, on relations with other agreements, ASEAN would like to see a provision stating that the instrument is consistent with other relevant international agreements related to multilateral nuclear disarmament and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and that it does not impose additional obligations on non-nuclear weapon states. And finally, on depository, ASEAN wishes to see the UN Secretary General designated as depository of the instrument as per established practice. Malaysia will also provide further views in our national capacity in our next turn. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Malaysia, and I give now the floor to the distinguished delegation of Indonesia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, my intervention is not substantive related. It's more of a housekeeping. I was hoping that, consistent with previous practice, that all the oral amendments that was just been delivered by the Madam President could be circulated in writing and be distributed to all delegations present here, as consistent to previous practice that was made a few days ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Indonesia. The Secretariat informs me that the amendments will be posted in the website in minutes. So you will have them at your disposal in writing. Thank you. Y ahora le doy la...
And now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Cuba. Many thanks, distinguished ambassador. Incidentally, it is a great pleasure to see you at the helm of this session for my delegation. I have a number of comments to make and a number of proposals regarding these articles, beginning first with Article 11. We wish to see this article begin with a new paragraph, and I will read this in English as proposed by us.
Sería el nuevo párrafo.
It would be the new paragraph 1 of Article 11.
May propose amendments to this convention. The text of any proposed amendment shall be submitted to the depository for circulation to all states parties. Ese sería, señor.
Chair, this would be a proposal for a new paragraph 1 for Article 11. We don't think that it is a controversial proposal because it's standard language that is used in a number of conventions and treaties, including several treaties and conventions within the arms control and disarmament sphere. As regards the current paragraph 1 of Article 11, I will confess that I'm not entirely clear regarding the meaning of this paragraph and why, more specifically, in the first line of the paragraph, we use the word may, because we use this word may, and that gives the possibility for a number of proposed amendments not to be considered by meetings of these states parties and review conferences. Of course, Cuba does not encourage the presentation of a plethora of amendments, an exaggerated number thereof. That would be unhelpful, but we do think that the presentation of amendments is a legitimate right to be exercised by state parties, and furthermore, states have every legitimate right to see their proposed amendments duly considered. Consequently, unless there is a substantive explanation given to us that can justify this use of the word may, we would propose the substitution of this word with the word shall. This would mean that the first line of current paragraph 1 of Article 11 would read as follows.
For states parties or review conferences, consideration shall be given, y continuaría el párrafo.
And the paragraph would continue to read as it currently stands. Article 12 now. Article 12 on settlement of disputes. Here we propose the addition of a new paragraph. It would be new paragraph 1 for Article 12. I will read this in English.
That may arise concerning the interpretation or application of this convention shall be settled in accordance with the relevant provisions of this convention and in conformity with the provision of the Charter of the United Nations. Le reitero.
Once again, Chair, this would be a proposal for a new paragraph 1 under Article 12. We have also taken as a basis for this proposal standard language from a number of conventions. In this specific case, this is language which is practically identical to that which is used in Article 14 on settlement of disputes under the Convention on Chemical Weapons. As far as the current paragraph 1 is concerned, current paragraph 1 under Article 12, we have a very simple proposed amendment to make for the second line, beginning below. It would be to add, after the phrase meetings of states parties, after that phrase we would add comma and. I will read the two last lines as they would read with our proposal.
Recourses to the meetings of states parties, comma, and by mutual consent, referral to the International Court of Justice in conformity with the statute of the court. Para Cuba, señor.
For Cuba, President, the key goal with these proposals is that it is made entirely clear that any referral of a case of a dispute to the ICJ should be a referral predicated upon the consent, mutual consent of the states involved. That needs to remain clear, and that is the goal of our proposal. As regards paragraph 2 of Article 12, we wish to propose the deletion from the first line, the first and the second line of this paragraph, the phrase which reads,
whatever means it deems appropriate. En caso,
if our proposal were not accepted, that is a proposal for new paragraph 1 for this Article 12, well, in that case, an alternative would be to see this phrase that I have proposed to delete be substituted by the following phrase, and I'll read this in English.
In accordance with the relevant provisions of this convention and in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. Las dos primeras líneas.
The two first lines of this paragraph 2 would thus read as follows with our proposed amendment.
These parties may contribute to the settlement of the dispute in accordance with the relevant provisions of this convention and in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, including, y el párrafo continuaría.
And the paragraph would continue to read as it currently stands. Now, where Article 17 is concerned, Article 17 on reservations, we propose the deletion of the first part, which reads,
of.
Deletion of the articles of. So Article 17 would read, this convention shall not be subject to reservations, quite simply. In our view, it is appropriate to delete the reference to this, the articles of this, to avoid misinterpretations of the preambular section of the convention. Or perhaps there would be an annex. This is something that's still subject to discussion. We would like to leave the door open to having this annex open to reservations. And the deletion of the phrase I previously read would leave that possibility open. To conclude, I have an amendment proposal for Article 19. Essentially, that would be to replace the current Article 19 with the following paragraph, and I'll read this in English.
Nothing in this convention shall be interpreted as in any way limiting or detracting from the obligations assumed by a state party under international law, including the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, nuclear weapons free zone treaties, and other legal instruments related to nuclear weapons. Estas son por el momento.
For the moment, President, these would be our proposed amendments that we submit for the consideration of all delegations. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you to Cuba. Thanks, Rodolfo, for those kind words. And thank you for those proposals. Of course, the Secretariat and the Presidency would appreciate the submission of those proposals in writing.
Now, the floor to the distinguished delegation from Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kazakhstan agrees with the application in Article 16 of the facilitated procedure for the entry into force of the treaty following the example of the Arms Trade Treaty after its ratification by a certain numbers of states. We also believe that the threshold of 40 states is too low. For example, the entry into force of the Arms Trade Treaty requires the accession of 50 states. We propose the draft document reflects the provision that following the entry into force of the Convention on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Convention on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, or the Comprehensive Nuclear Weapons Convention will be developed and signed. In terms of withdrawing from the Convention, in line with Article 18 of the draft Convention, we note that the text says, the state notifies all other parties to the Convention and the UN Security Council on withdrawal 3 months in advance. We acknowledge that United Nations Security Council permanent members do not intend to participate in negotiations or the future convention as a whole. With this in mind, we propose the words the United Nations Security Council are replaced with United Nations General Assembly. Alternatively, the document should emphasize the importance of the United Nations Security Council and its permanent members in contributing to international peace and security. On Article 19, we will give our position later on. And finally, we believe that it is not worthwhile to create new organizations at this stage. This should become the prerogative of a comprehensive convention. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Kazakhstan, and now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Egypt. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Like many delegations, Articles 11 to Article 21 is to a large extent very standardized and straightforward. But nevertheless, we have a few amendments that we would like to propose. The first amendment which we are suggesting would be in Article 16, related to the entry into force, and on the same lines of the proposal made by the distinguished delegate of Malaysia on behalf of ASEAN. We would like to see some reference to the United Nations Secretary General as a depository of this convention. And in this line, we would like to suggest a new paragraph, which would be 16.3, which would state as follows: the United Nations Secretary General shall promptly inform all signatory and acceding states of the date of each signature, the date of deposit of each instrument of ratification or of accession, and the date of the entry into force of this convention and of the receipt of other notices. This is a standardized paragraph which we see in many other disarmament-related treaties and other treaties, and therefore we would like to see its incorporation in Article 16. Another amendment in Article 18, we would like to see the title amended to be duration and withdrawal, not just simply duration. And we would like to see an amendment in Article 18, subparagraph 2. We would prefer a watered-down phrase or watered-down language related to withdrawal. And even though we are conscious of the fact that this is standard language oftentimes used in several disarmament treaties, we are of the preference that the article on withdrawal would be watered down. So it would read as follows: each state party shall, in exercising its national sovereignty, have the right to withdraw from the convention if it decides that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of this convention have jeopardized the supreme interests of its country, period. And therefore we would delete the remaining paragraph. And I think the point raised by the distinguished delegate of Kazakhstan in the previous statement is also a worthy note to take on board, that given the complexities and the dynamics related to this convention and the issue of the members of the Security Council, and they're not involved in this process, I think this is an important issue to put into account in this relation. With regards to Article 19, my delegation is in favor of deleting it completely. We believe that there is no really merit into try in making some sort of linkage in this way with the NPT. We think that articles or references in the preamble to this convention related to the centrality and cornerstone of the NPT suffices. We believe that any reference in the way it is phrased in the zero draft or through the formulation presented by the Madam President is in a way or another indicative in one way that we may all be concerned that there is some sort of duplication or duplicity with regards to the NPT, and I think we shouldn't be concerned about this issue here. And by actually spelling it out, it raises the concern that maybe there is an issue that is there, and therefore to avoid and prevent this kind of ambiguity, I think it is we would suggest and prefer to delete Article 19 in its entirety. These are my substantive comments. A quick linguistic possible suggestion to rephrase in Article 13 on universality. On the second sentence, I think it would maybe sound a little bit better if we say with the goal of achieving or realizing the adherence of states to this convention instead of attracting. Achieving or realizing, I think, would sound a bit better. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Egypt for his intervention, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation from Malaysia.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, Chair. Just give me 1 second. I was in a discussion with my colleague. All right. Thank you. We have a number of comments that we have in our national capacity with regard to articles that we are discussing. First of all, when it comes to the amendments in Article 11, we feel that this article needs to be reconceptualized in terms of its drafting. In its current formulation, we feel that the procedure specified and the threshold numbers needed for amendments to pass open this article to potential misuse, which could affect the purposes and objectives of this instrument. As such, we feel that the amendment procedure should include the usual process that is found in many other instruments, such as those found in the APLC, CCM, CCW, ATT, whereby amendments are first circulated through the depository to all state parties, and if a specified number of state parties support the amendment within a specified time frame, only then does the amendment be taken up at the appropriate fora. In this regard, we have some language to propose. It is 5 specific paragraphs. They are quite lengthy, so I think to save time, it would be necessary for me to read it out now. But can I just read what it proposes? 1 is that it is a process that support for considering an amendment is first sought before it is considered in a fora. 2, that the specified number of states supporting an amendment be a majority of state parties to the instrument. 3 is that within a specified time frame, state parties need to express support for that amendment. Next is that we are flexible as to whether this amendment is taken up at the MSP or the REFCON. The next part is that when at the appropriate fora, whether it is the MSP or the REFCON, then the amendment can be passed with those 2/3 present and voting. And lastly, I think the most important thing in terms of substance, separate from procedure, is that any amendment to the procedure should not go against the purposes and objectives of that instrument. So we will be sending that by email to the Secretariat. If we may comment on a few other articles. With regard to Articles 14 and 15, we view that these could go together into a single article. Again, we have about 4 sort of new sub-articles to go in. But the essence of what we are proposing within replacing 14 and 15 into one single article is basically a paragraph that states that the treaty shall be open for signature from such and such a date, and we take into account what the President of the conference had mentioned before, that it should be 4 weeks after the adoption of the instrument. The second is that it would be subject to ratification, acceptance, or approval by each signatory state. The third is that following its entry into force, it shall be open for session. And then finally, it should be deposited with a depository. This is language that is found in other instruments. With regard to Article 17, we are fine with the language as is there now. But should there be annexes to this convention, which at this moment is uncertain? There is the annex and safeguards, but that may be removed. But should there be annexes to this convention, then it is our view that annexes shall not be subject to reservations incompatible with the objects and purposes of the instrument. And finally, on Article 19, with regard to the relationship with other agreements, we had heard what the President had said. We agree with that that's the direction which we should go into. But the language that we would look forward to is perhaps language taken from ATT Article 26.1, which is a general formulation that states the implementation of this treaty shall not prejudice obligations undertaken by state parties with regard to existing or future international agreements to which they are parties, where those obligations are consistent with this treaty. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Malaysia for his statement, and I now doy la palabra a la...
I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Many thanks, Vice Chair. I'm grateful to... I'm delighted to see you at the helm of our work for the moment. Regarding the articles currently being considered, Article 11, first of all, the comment made by the distinguished ambassador of Cuba is a very appropriate one. Indeed, a States Parties Conference is not obliged to adopt an amendment, but there is an obligation to submit it for discussion. So there is an issue of language, perhaps, and we'll have to look at the language proposed, but perhaps it would be a good idea to change the first line of paragraph 1 of Article 11. So it simply says, at the meetings of States Parties or Review Conference, consideration will be given to any proposal, etc., etc. Will is perhaps a suitable amendment without any prejudice to any other proposals suggested or put forward in this regard. Now, regarding Article 12, paragraph 2, it talks here about this, well, talking about the second line. The second line says the meeting of states parties may contribute to the settlement of the dispute by whatever means it deems appropriate. That's the first and second line. This is perhaps a little broad, a little vague. It's very vague here what type of dispute you're talking about, naval blockades or I don't know. Of course things have to be in line with the Charter, but perhaps the drafting proposal put forward by Cuba just a few moments ago is the most appropriate proposal where this article is concerned. Now, Article 16 is appropriate. We are flexible regarding the number of ratifications, but we do think that the initial universal nature of the instrument needs to be reflected, I think, but there are no conditions to be stipulated here. We fully agree with Article 17. Once again, we think the comments made by the delegation of Cuba were very appropriate. There are articles that can have reservations put to them, but what we're globally talking about is the convention, of course. So you can just simply write, this convention shall not be subject to reservations. Now, as regards Article 18, we agree that duration should be unlimited given the nature of this instrument. But also, in light of the nature of this instrument, we believe that the serious matter of the possibility of withdrawing from this treaty should be a possibility subject to strict discussion and stringent discussion by all of us here present. If you'll allow me, Vice President, I'd just like to read Article 56 of the Vienna Convention on Law of the Treaties. I'm reading this in English.
A treaty which contains no provision regarding its termination and which does not provide for denunciation or withdrawal is not subject to denunciation or withdrawal. Unless there are two conditions. A, it is established that the parties intended to admit the possibility of denunciation or withdrawal, or B, a right of denunciation or withdrawal may be implied by the nature of the treaty. Nos parece en todo.
In any case, in our view, and for this reason I would reiterate the request made by others regarding the proposals made by the chair. We do need to study this text. I had looked at the documents from the conference, but things are a little bit confused. I don't know what stage proposals are. It would perhaps be useful to have them in the room. In any case, we believe that the current this section as currently drafted regarding denunciation in Article 18, that phrasing is too kind of easy, if you like. It's too easy to withdraw from the treaty, and given the nature of this treaty, I don't think that wording is appropriate. Trade treaties have denunciation deadlines of 5 to 10 years. Investment protection treaties that have wreaked so much havoc on our continent, for example, they have that 5 to 10 year withdrawal or denunciation period. In this case, my delegation would prefer to see this treaty not be subject to denunciation, or for that provision not to be present. If states participants here think that the possibility for denunciation should be provided, we need to discuss the conditions under which that denunciation will be allowed to take place, discuss deadlines, timeframes, and what happens when such a request is made. It's not a trivial gesture for a treaty like this to denounce or withdraw from it. Now, regarding Article 19, the proposal made by the President seems to be an interesting one, but once again, we'd like to have it to hand so we can look at it, but we do believe it's moving in the right direction, and delegations have made proposals in connection with that. Thank you.
Agradezco la distinguida delegación.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Ecuador for its
floor to the distinguished delegation of Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, and let me begin by thanking through you also the President for having presented a number of amendments to these provisions that do improve the text from our point of view and from the legal point of view. We have a general comment on Article 11, subparagraph 2, that we would like to put to the floor. We see the provision as currently drafted such that it will necessarily lead to different regimes within this conventional treaty, and most probably so at an indefinite time frame, because there is no clause in that provision for an entry into force of an amendment for all states after a certain threshold has been achieved. This might be particularly problematic if we think about possible amendments to the core prohibitions of the treaty. If, for example, the prohibitions are broadened by amendment, are made more inclusive, more specific, etc., it could be undesirable to have competitive regimes indefinitely within the framework of this treaty. So we would simply suggest that a discussion takes place on whether a different format for the entry into force of amendments would be useful here, and my delegation would certainly support that. On the Article 12, the settlement of disputes, by way of a general comment, what we miss a little bit here in this article is a lack of a sequence in the settlement of disputes, different stages that should be accomplished in settlement of a dispute, and from our point of view, once all means have been exhausted to try and settle a dispute, there should be the possibility to refer an issue to the ICJ if one of the parties to the conflict so chooses. So we would propose the following amendment we would delete in the fourth line, after including, we would delete the rest of this paragraph and replace it with arbitration, full stop, and then the phrase, if within X months such means fail to settle the dispute, any one of the parties to the dispute may refer the dispute to the International Court of Justice. With regard to Article 614 on the signature, we're grateful for the provisions provided by OLA and would also have a question on this article, namely if the signature of the convention should not be provided as a possibility to states indefinitely, so as to provide a soft entry into the regime of the treaty. In particular, taking into account the significance, the legal significance, according to the Vienna Convention, the law of treaties, of a signature, namely not to act against the purpose and spirit of a convention. It would provide for us a useful means to provide a soft entry for states to approach the regime. So we would actually favor the deletion of the last part of this article, so that it would read, this convention shall be open for signature to all states. On the next page, we have a suggestion for a reformulation of Article 17 that does preserve the meaning of the article. We would propose the formulation, no reservation may be made to this convention, which seems to us to be more straightforward. With regard to Article 18, we see the point to change the title of the article into duration and withdrawal, as has been proposed by other states. And on subparagraph 2, we believe there's significant potential for streamlining. From our perspective, the subparagraph 2 could simply read, each state party shall have the right to withdraw from the convention. We would, of course, add the revised formulation on the depository giving notice of such a withdrawal. But from our point of view, this paragraph could be very simple in that sense. On subparagraph 3, we would favor a period of 12 months until a withdrawal takes effect. And yes, that's our amendment to that subparagraph. Article 19, we do see value in having that article specifying the relationship with other regimes, and agree with, among others, the President that it needs to be carefully drafted. We are grateful to the Cuban delegation for the proposal they've put forward, and we will study it once we have seen it in writing. And that are our comments for this part. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Liechtenstein for its statement. Y ahora le doy la palabra a la
I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Chile. Thank you, Chairman, Vice Chairman. Obviously, I'm very happy to see you chairing our discussion. First of all, I'll be very brief, I promise. My delegation would like to refer to Article 11, Para 1. On this, my delegation shares the view of the delegation of Cuba, in that without prejudging the decisions that will be adopted at the review conference on this, on the proposed amendments, all states should have the right to submit these proposals and for these proposed amendments to be considered, at least by the conference. Now, on Article 17, We also support the Cuban proposal, and that the current wording should opens the possibility for some parties to the convention that they could be subject to reservations by states. On Article 18, my delegation considers that this is a key aspect of this instrument. This is why we don't support proposals aimed at weakening this mechanism, to denounce the treaty or cancel it. We believe that this article should be even further strengthened to avoid a situation where a state party can simply withdraw from the treaty easily, because this could have very serious consequences. And lastly, Mr. Vice Chair, on Article 19, I'd just like to recall that one of the main arguments that has been mentioned by some states to justify their non-participation in this historic conference was precisely the concern for the supposed damage that this new instrument could have for the non-proliferation treaty. For this reason, we believe that it's very important to include this specific reference here. And we believe that we could follow the wording proposed by Cuba, that is name the NPT or mention the NPT, including some of the major instruments, including the nuclear free zones treaties. But my delegation also would add the comprehensive test ban treaty, to add that to the list of instruments referred to here. That would be all for now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you to the delegation of Chile for your statement.
The distinguished delegation from the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. A general remark under this cluster and then specific remarks on Article 13 and 19. Regarding the provisions in this cluster, we felt, looking at the original text which was under consideration, that the draft treaty could be further streamlined and brought further into line with existing practice regarding final clauses. And now, of course, we will carefully study the text proposals in this regard as just read out by the Chair. On Article 13, we suggest to delete this article. We, of course, support to strive for universality. We do not see the need for a separate provision to this end. It would be better to design other ways to promote dialogue with states not party to the Convention, in our view. On Article 19, for the Netherlands, it is crucial to see stronger links between the Convention and the NPT. And although Article 19 covers the relationship between the two instruments, the hierarchy, in our view, must be clarified. The majority of states here consider this instrument to be a step towards the implementation of Article 6, and this legal relationship, in our view, must be reflected in the draft. And we suggest to add the following to this article, and I quote, "In case of any conflict between this instrument and the NPT, the provisions of the NPT and their interpretation prevail," unquote. In addition, we would like to ensure the integrity of the NPT by including a paragraph that states that adherence to the NPT is an obligation under this convention. And furthermore, we will carefully study the text proposals on Article 19 just read out by the Chair, as well as the other text proposals. Thanks so much, Mr. Vice President.
Thanks to the Netherlands for its intervention, and now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. On Article 11, we would like to support the amendments proposed by Malaysia. In particular, we see a value in explicitly mentioning the two-thirds majority with regard to amendment. That seems to be very much in line with the spirit of this convention. On Article 13, we believe that it could be useful to insert a specific date for signature of the convention, as was also suggested by Malaysia. On Article 18, we would like to support the amendment of the title as explained as presented by Egypt. Yes, to include and withdrawal in the title. We would also welcome the amendment presented by the President that the depository shall circulate a possible note of withdrawal. However, we do not see the necessity to circulate the withdrawal note also directly to the Security Council. On Article 19, we welcome suggestions made on that article and believe that the relation with other agreements should certainly also include a clear reference to clarify that the obligations and rights from other treaties shall be in line with the object and purpose of the Convention. We could also think of including an explicit reference to some important international disarmament instruments as proposed by Cuba, such as the NPT or the CTBT. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Austria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I have a number of comments on the articles under discussion now. Firstly, Article 11 on amendment. My delegation considers that it would be useful to spell out in rather more detail in the text how it is that this provision would operate in practice. For example, as drafted, the article is silent as to exactly who it is who can submit proposals for amendments. Other treaties provide that only states parties have the ability to propose amendments, and we assume that this is also the intention here. Article 11 is also silent as to whether states parties will be given a particular period of time in which to consider a proposed amendment before being required to take action on it, coupled with the fact that a decision on amendment can be taken by any meeting or review conference of states parties, and not only at a particular amendment conference as provided, for instance, in the Cluster Munitions Convention. We note that this significantly lowers the threshold for amending the Convention, and we would therefore recommend the tightening of this provision, for example, by requiring a proposal for amendment to be circulated at least 90 days before it can be considered for adoption. With respect to Article 14, Mr. Vice President, we understand that the specific dates and locations for signature of the treaty will be incorporated into the text as we move forward with our negotiations here. As regards Article 16 on entry into force, we recognise the different views that have been expressed regarding the appropriate number of ratifications needed for entry into force. On the one hand, we are aware of the persuasive arguments that emphasise the importance that there be no unnecessary impediment to the entry into force of the treaty, and after all, we have all lived through the experience of the CTBT. But we hear too the observations of those who note that, given the importance of the treaty we are negotiating here, the number of ratifications needed for entry into force should not be an insignificant one. New Zealand can understand the sentiment underlying both these viewpoints, and accordingly we are rather flexible as to the specific number of ratifications. We care rather more that the treaty does indeed enter into force than we care about the exact number of ratifications which brings this about. And it may well be that Madam President has selected an appropriate number for entry into force in the present Article 16. New Zealand welcomes the fact that Article 17 allows for no reservations to be made. This is consistent with other similar treaties in our field and something we consider entirely appropriate. With respect to Article 19, New Zealand would prefer to see a different formulation than that which has been put forward in our text here, and indeed than that which Madam President outlined at the start of this session. We agree with Malaysia on this and with their proposal, which as I understand it reads, the implementation of this treaty shall not prejudice obligations with regard to existing or future international agreements to which they are parties where those obligations are consistent with this treaty. This proposal, which replicates the language in Article 26 of the Arms Trade Treaty, in our view, would obviate the need to refer to either the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the CTBT or indeed any other agreement. Above all, we believe that this proposed text put forward by Malaysia appropriately registers the fundamental importance of the obligations we are undertaking in this new treaty of ours. Finally, Mr. Vice President, I would like to enter a specific vote of thanks to the Secretariat here. And I would normally expect to do this at the end of our session on 7 July. But I wanted to thank them for going today, for me, beyond the normal call of duty, and to thank them for having found a replacement for my reading glasses, which I just broke early in the afternoon. My thanks to the Secretariat. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Well, Madam, it gives me great pleasure to convey to the Secretariat your words of encouragement and gratitude. And, of course, I thank you for your intervention. And now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Mozambique.
I thank you very much, Mr. President, and we are delighted to see you presiding over our work. Mr. President, my delegation had a few written comments on this cluster of articles. But I'm afraid that after the Cuban delegation has spoken, those amendments that we had have largely been preempted and exhausted. So I would like to thank Cuba for their very positive amendments which coincide with ours. And we shall endorse those amendments, even though we would like to see them in a written form distributed to all of us. We would also like to support those who have spoken in favor of streamlining some of these articles, bringing in some economy in the drafting. Let me single out in particular that we agree very much with the draft Article 17, prohibiting reservations, and draft Article 19, which establishes relations with other agreements. We think that it is important, yes, that we consider the relationship between this future treaty with others of similar scope and nature. But establishing relationship does not necessarily mean hierarchy. So we think that we should be guided by the letter and the spirit of the agreements or the treaties that already exist. So these are a few comments that we wanted to say on top of endorsing the Cuban amendments because they are politically well-founded and legally very, very sound. So thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Mozambique for its intervention, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It gives me great pleasure to see a representative of our region up there. I have comments that will sort of, all of them, I guess, supporting someone else's comment, but I think it's important to sort of draw an impression as to perhaps where the sentiment of the room is going. So first, I think the distinguished ambassador of Cuba made a series of very useful and relevant proposals. I start with Article 11. In fact, I think there's need to clarify a little bit more who can make amendments and how this works. The ambassador of Cuba proposes to start with any state party may, so I guess that clarifies the question of who may present amendments. We also support the idea behind Malaysia's proposal that amendments should not be inconsistent with the principles and objectives of the treaty. I think in particular this treaty, that's an important caveat to make in Article 11 itself, because we do not wish to change the nature of this treaty through amendments. I think in Article 12, settlement of disputes, I see also merit in Liechtenstein's comment regarding some sort of an improved sequencing of actions with regarding disputes. I think that would be an improvement. I think there has to be some sort of a progression in dispute settlements that is always extremely positive for friendly settlement of divergencies before members resort to other actions that may escalate the dispute. Again, we would also support the proposal, I think it was also made by Cuba, to remove whatever means it deems appropriate in para 2 of Article 12. I think this also important to include a reference as per Cuba to the treaty itself and the Charter of the UN as elements to be, as primary elements to be used in settlement of disputes, not whatever means anyone deems appropriate, but we start with the treaty itself and with the Charter. Article 13, I also take the point, is just a language issue, but Egypt made a point attracting the adherence of all states to this convention with achieving or realizing, or a better wording for this, and we agree. I think on Article 16, we are of the mind of New Zealand that we want to see the treaty entering into force. Of course, I think the threshold should be a feasible and viable one, and not one that sets us back many years. So I think perhaps the President has provided us with such, with a positive proposal here, with the number 40. Against no reservations, we think reservations should not be allowed with respect to the convention as a whole or the treaty as a whole. So I think removing articles, as Cuba has proposed, is also we support. We support changing the title of 18. We support some stronger withdrawal conditions. And we believe we should delete this reference to the UN Security Council. I don't think notice should necessarily be given to the UN Security Council. In fact, some of the permanent members will probably not be members of this treaty for some time to come. So we agree with those who have proposed that. To make it stronger, perhaps withdrawal should take effect 12 months and not 3 months after receipt of the instrument. That would be more aligned, I think, with the overall standard for agreements. And finally, we would very strongly support Malaysia's proposal to use ATT Article 26 language verbatim for Article 19 on relations with other agreements, as was read out, I think, by Malaysia itself and by New Zealand. We fully support the use of Article 26 of ATT. We think it is a huge improvement, and it makes unnecessary to specifically mention particular agreements. I think it's a much better solution. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Brazil and his kind words addressed to the Vice Chair. And now I give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It is a Swiss priority in these negotiations that we do not create a new norm that is not compatible with existing agreements or raises questions with regard to its relationship with other agreements. So it's no surprise that we do support having an article specifying relationships with other agreements. So with regard to Article 19, we cannot support the proposal from the distinguished delegate from Egypt to simply delete Article 19, rather on the contrary. And I would like to raise 2 points with this regard. The language should not only cover the NPT, and should be able to relate to and encompass both existing and future instruments. On the one hand, we are thinking about the CTBT, and on the other hand, we are thinking of a future treaty regarding fissile material production, or other treaties in the nuclear disarmament field which have not been negotiated. The language should focus on the obligations and not relate to the rights under the treaty. This is mainly because of the discriminatory character of the NPT. Accordingly, we would suggest a wording similar to what we have in the ATT and has been suggested by others like Malaysia and supported by Brazil. That is a wording along the lines, the implementation of this convention shall not prejudice obligations undertaken by states parties with regard to existing or future international agreements to which they are parties, where those obligations are consistent with this convention. In addition, we would like to add a provision that stipulates that nothing in this treaty can be invoked to justify the withdrawal from the NPT. At this point, I want to reiterate that my delegation wishes to gain clarity on what is prohibited and what will not be prohibited under this treaty. Therefore, in addition to an article on the relations with other agreements, Switzerland also suggests to add an article on rights of states parties to this agreement. This article should have the following elements. That is, A, some provisions regarding the peaceful use of nuclear energy. This treaty should ensure the inalienable right to use nuclear energy. The language could draw from Article 4.1 of the NPT, which states, nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to the treaty to develop research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. B, the treaty should preserve the right of states to participate in exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific and technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. C, regarding military cooperation, this treaty should ensure that states party to this treaty may engage in military cooperation and operations with states not party to the treaty, which might engage for their part in activities prohibited to a state party. And last but not least, D, regarding CBRN defense, this treaty should guarantee the legitimate security interests of all states regarding the conduct of research and development in CBRN protection, including cooperation with states not party and their national and private research institutions. Now let me turn to Article 18. We support that the treaty is of unlimited duration. We also support that there should be a right to withdraw from this treaty in case of extraordinary events. Such a provision is standard in our field of activity and is essential for the universalization of the treaty. We also support that a notice that includes a statement of the extraordinary events should be provided in case of withdrawal. With regard to paragraph 3 of Article 18, we fully support the first sentence as reflected in the zero draft. That is, that the withdrawal should only take effect 3 months after the receipt of the instrument of withdrawal by the depository. With regard to the second sentence, we would suggest to simply refer to armed conflict. The sentence would read then, if, however, on the expiry of the 3-month period, the withdrawing state party is a party to an armed conflict, the withdrawal shall not take effect before the state party is no longer party to an armed conflict. This is simply to make things easier, and we could simply say that the withdrawal should only take effect if the withdrawing state party is not a party to an armed conflict, alternatively. We would also propose another paragraph stating that the withdrawal of a state party from this convention shall not in any way affect the duty to continue to fulfilling the obligations assumed under any relevant rules of international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegation from Switzerland for the statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have a few comments to make on these final clauses. On Article 11, paragraph 1, Mr. Vice President, we do believe that this paragraph should be tight, rigid, and strict. It needs more improvement in terms of the, way of adopting amendments, the number of, for example, states parties who should participate and vote for the amendments. I do not say any specific figure here, but I think we need to have widest possible support for any amendments of this important treaty. On subpara 2, I think the point made by Liechtenstein is a valid one. By this kind of wording here, I'm afraid we are going to have a different regimes for the member states in terms of the entry into force of the amendments. I think it has to be modified in line to have, it can be modified in line with the, paragraph which we have in the CWC. Regarding the settlement of disputes, considering the nature of this treaty, I don't think that we need to have a lengthy and detailed paragraph regarding settlement of disputes. The suggestion made by the distinguished ambassador of Cuba as the first paragraph, I think, in our view, is enough, or just making a reference to the, or mentioning the Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. On universality, the point made by Egypt, distinguished representative of Egypt, is a good suggestion that instead of attracting, we can have achieving or realizing. On Article 16, I do agree with New Zealand that it has to be more detailed. And the number of threshold should be higher than this because, for example, just the number of members of nuclear weapon-free zones at present, I guess it is more than 100. So there should not be any concern regarding the number of countries for the entry into force of this treaty. We haven't conditioned this to the accession of ratification by the nuclear weapon states. So there shouldn't be any concern as we have now regarding CTBT. So I think it should be higher than 14th. And on reservations, I think the core articles of this convention should not be subject to reservations. For example, from 1 to 9. But regarding other provisions, considering, pending to the final shape of this treaty, I think we should not close the door for other non-core articles of this convention for reservation. Regarding withdrawal, I agree with Liechtenstein that we can have a simple wording regarding withdrawal. Even if we are going to have the first paragraph here, the second paragraph here, referencing to Security Council, while none of the permanent members are here in these negotiations, is not suitable one, and we should modify it in this line. Regarding the third paragraph of Article 18, this is a question whether we have such a precedent in other conventions or not. While, of course, if we have nuclear weapon states on board in this treaty, it will be very dear to us to make the withdrawal as much as difficult as possible. But this is legally speaking, I'm asking this question that whether we have precedent like this, because withdrawal is a security sovereignty right of each and every state parties. We should see whether making it conditional to the specific situation is, even with the suggestion that made just now by distinguished representative of Switzerland, is it legal or not? On the relations with other agreements, we think we can split it to two paragraphs. One paragraph goes to the rights under the NPT. One paragraph goes to obligations, not to make this confusion regarding the obligation and to preventing the confusion regarding the obligations of state parties under the NPT. So regarding rights, we can have, I will provide the wording to the Secretariat in writing regarding the rights, which is in line with the suggestions made with the Senate delegation of Cuba, but it is limited just to NPT. And regarding obligations, simply we can say something that we have mentioned here with a slight modification that I will provide it to the Secretariat. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now doy la palabra.
I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Colombia. Many thanks, Vice President. As regards the articles which we have been asked to consider now in this meeting, allow me to make the following comments. As regards Article 13 on universality, this notion of universality does not depend on the enthusiasm which states parties express when it comes to new states, but rather things that they need to convince nuclear weapons possessing states to accede. So the only way that this convention can become fully effective is by it becoming totally universal, and that's why we need to ensure that its consent pursues that aim. On Article 19, at the end of this article, we could include and other nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation related treaties. This bears in mind the fact that the NPT is the very cornerstone of existing agreements on nuclear issues. I thank the distinguished delegation of Colombia.
Distinguished delegation of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. First, I would like to address Article 11, amendments, and Here I very much agree with the delegation of Malaysia and others like New Zealand that this is a little bit too lightly drafted, I would say, and we need a more precise provision concerning amendments. And here we would like to propose that we pick up the corresponding languages from the Ottawa and the Cluster Convention, which specifies in detail how amendments should be made. We will provide them to you later on. Then the next comments we have is on Article 16, entry into force. And on 16.1, I would like to. We have no chair, no president. Now she's coming. Well, on 16.1, I would like to propose, instead of 40th instrument, I would like to propose 65th instrument. Why am I proposing this? Well, the reason is that we were thinking that this corresponds roughly to a third of the membership of the United Nations and approximately half of the participants during the first session of our negotiation. And we also feel that in order for the treaty to be a credible one, we need a sufficient number of signatories before entering into force. On Article 18, we would support the proposal by Egypt that we label this duration and withdrawal, and we would also support that we delete the United Nations Security Council here, and instead we mention the depository. We would also like to propose the deletion of subparagraph 3, so delete 18.3. Then finally, we would like on Article 19 to support the paragraph that was proposed by Malaysia, New Zealand and Switzerland, and also to add a second paragraph there under Article 19, the one that was proposed by Switzerland and dealt with the NPT. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Sweden. Ambassador Valda, I now give the floor to the delegation of South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. I will restrict my comments to those articles that we believe could be further improved. We welcome the text on Article 12 on the settlement of disputes. In our view, this is a very important element in the Convention, and we support the general approach of consultations in line with other international instruments to resolve any disputes. In that regard, we have listened carefully to the proposals made by Cuba, which we believe could serve as a useful basis for further discussion. On Article 18, we support an unlimited duration for the treaty. However, from our perspective, it is unnecessary for this treaty to explicitly deal with the issue of withdrawal. By describing circumstances under which states can withdraw and how they should go about doing so, we may be unintentionally condoning circumstances under which the pursuance of the nuclear weapons option may be justified. The issue of withdrawal from treaties is already dealt with under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and such a provision therefore seems unnecessary. With regard to Article 19, as explained earlier, although the text is consistent with South Africa's national positions on the NPT, and we are committed to ensure that this new instrument does not undermine but instead strengthen other international instruments dealing with nuclear weapons, the inclusion of such an article in the treaty is rather problematic. In our view, Article 19 as currently formulated is both selective in referring to only one treaty can be objected to by non-state parties, and is superfluous from a legal perspective and should therefore be deleted. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of South Africa. I now give the floor to the delegation of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. Firstly, on Article 11, we welcome the very careful attention to this article that we've heard here from New Zealand, Brazil, Malaysia and other delegates. My delegation believes that we do need to exercise care and caution regarding the provisions relating to amendments. Therefore, we would agree that the current formula of a two-thirds majority of those present to agree amendments may be too low a threshold, and we welcome the interesting suggestion made by our Malaysian colleague in this regard. Another option could be to have a three-quarters majority here, which we realise is unusual but may be warranted in this situation when it comes to nuclear weapons. We also note that there is no specific reference to the treatment of any additional protocols or other instruments which may be required. We would propose a paragraph which would read, "The present convention may be complemented by additional protocols or other instruments necessary for its universalization or implementation or otherwise related to its object and purpose as decided by the meetings of states parties or by the RevCon," and we'd be happy to provide that language in writing. On Article 14, we would support the suggestion from Liechtenstein that the Convention will be open for signature indefinitely. There's currently no article on accession. Depending on developments in Articles 2 to 5, we may need a new article on accession, and my delegation reserves the right to return to this point later. On Article 18, my delegation would have a preference to see withdrawal being made much harder and very much as a last resort. We would therefore support the 12-month period which has been proposed by Liechtenstein. In addition, to further strengthen this provision, we would suggest that states parties should address the notice of withdrawal with the issuing state as a matter of urgency, with the aim of trying to resolve the concerns raised before the formal withdrawal process is triggered. And we would suggest an additional provision that any withdrawal should not violate the UN Charter and its objectives of peace and security. Finally, Madam President, to come to Article 19. This article and this issue of the relationship between this convention and the NPT and other instruments is of great importance to my delegation. We therefore thank you for the new drafting suggestion you have given us today, and we also welcome the interesting proposals from the floor, which we will study very carefully, in particular those from Malaysia and New Zealand, which were supported by Brazil and many others, as we find this formulation very helpful. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the delegation of Ireland for that statement. We have a number of delegations who still wish to take the floor, but given that we are nearing the end of today's meeting, I wish to take this time to deal with a number of issues which are as of yet unresolved. The first of those is the reference to the issue of the compilation of proposals that are being presented by delegations. We need to deal with that. This compilation of proposals is being updated every day on the basis of the proposals which are being received or which have been received until that day. All proposals are being consolidated and gathered together in a single document. That document is available in Word format to make it easier to access and download. The document can be found on the website of the conference, and it is entitled under the section Communications of the President. So there is a compilation of today's proposals. When we have received all the proposals, I hope we will do at the close of business. I hope we'll receive all of those proposals, and so that will allow us to update the document so that tomorrow it will be fully updated. You will also remember that we've made significant progress with our discussions on the preambular section. And in light of that, we had committed as a team to undertaking an initial consolidation process of proposals made to the preambular section. I'd just like to inform you that I counted around 3 dozen new paragraphs that were submitted by delegations as proposals. So, essentially what I tried to do was to synthesize all of these proposals. I tried to include and incorporate all of the comments and proposals made on the preambular section over the course of this session. But I did that ensuring or attempting to ensure that one fundamental characteristic remained in this section, and that is, well, I bore in mind that the preambular sections of legal instruments are preambular sections which are concise in nature. And these differ from the preambular sections of resolutions, which are much lengthier. So the main challenge before us, I believe, is that of ensuring that we consolidate all proposals into a concise preambular section and make it one that takes on board differing visions of various delegations. I'm going to present this preambular section to you. The Secretariat has put it online, I think, or will do so. It will be uploaded by the Secretariat before 6 o'clock, before the close of today's meeting, for your consideration. And we will have a focal point as part of the Presidency's support team, and that's the colleague to my right, Ambassador Lissano. This colleague will be the focal point. Delegations can find my colleague tomorrow to discuss the preambular section. As I said, this was a commitment that we made as the Presidency, given the progress that we made in the first days of our meeting. What we are now trying to do in light of that commitment is to consolidate proposals made, looking at proposals for new language, and I looked at those indeed, and I incorporated elements on which there was agreement, and I incorporated the proposals which could bring us nearer to consensus into this preambular section. As far as possible, I attempted to consolidate similar proposals so that requests to incorporate new elements into existing structures were taken on board. The overriding idea was to avoid repetition. Nevertheless, we also acknowledge the fact that such radical attempts to synthesize a lot of proposals and synthesize proposals which differed. There were nuances that differed from proposals, and in this consolidation exercise, nuances were often lost and can be lost. Emphasis changed, but we are ready and willing to talk with delegations and make any necessary adjustments in light of the fact that some nuances may have been lost. I'd just like to underscore or highlight a number of broad areas on which we worked. I'd just like to make a few general comments. We did manage to incorporate most proposals made regarding central issues, key issues, and in so doing we maintained in place the pillars of the preambular section. to which we previously referred when we presented the preambular section. Now, these pillars are the reference to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the reference to international law, international humanitarian law, including human rights, the link between this instrument and all of the institutional framework in the field of disarmament. There was also the pillar which involved acknowledging victims, the acknowledgement and recognition of the various strategic stakeholders that played their part in ensuring that this conference today was able to take place and became a reality. They are, if you like, the four main pillars that have been retained in this preambular section, but I have, in addition to these pillars, attempted to incorporate the majority of issues that you wanted to see reflected in the text. But I did see that there was a great deal of common ground in the proposal submitted, so I think that in light of all of the above, we are working well and we are coming to the end of today's meeting. And I'd like to say that for the thematic group that will be considering this afternoon, as far as the thematic cluster that we were considering this afternoon is concerned, Ecuador, Indonesia, Venezuela and Mexico have yet to take the floor. But I did make a commitment to you to hear your views, and so I would like to honour that commitment if possible. But I think that we have worked well to consolidate all proposals, and I will upload the proposals considered to the consolidated document as soon as the meeting closes. I would invite you to be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and now I declare the session meeting closed, but the delegations that have yet to take the floor on this cluster can do so tomorrow morning. See you all tomorrow morning. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. The 18th plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination, is called to order. The conference will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9, Cluster 5, Articles 7 to 10. Since this is a first reading of the proposed text proposed for this conference, I want to remind delegations to indicate their desire to speak by pressing the microphone request button. We still have a few speakers left from this morning's session. In fact, we have 8. Starting with the Holy See, then Chile, Liechtenstein, Vietnam, Algeria, Ecuador, Mexico, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. First of all, I give the floor to the Holy See.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My delegation would like to comment Article 8. Bearing in mind the very severe humanitarian consequences of nuclear explosions, my delegation considers that Article 8 is of great importance. This is why we need to focus particular and serious attention on this, due to this is directly related to the issue of assisting victims and cleaning up the environment. My delegation would like to recall that Article 8 should be considered in close coordination with Articles 6 and 13. To be absolutely clear, we'd like to propose 2 amendments regarding the fund of voluntary contributions to support assistance to victims and cleaning up the environment. Bearing in mind the difficulties of smaller states in providing this assistance by themselves, my delegation wishes to change the title of Article 8 from International Cooperation to International Cooperation and Assistance.
Alors,
So, we'd replace the current title International Cooperation with International Cooperation and Assistance. Furthermore, as we've already proposed under Article 6, we suggest moving paragraph 3 from Article 6 and to insert it as a third paragraph in Article 8, to have a clearer and more coherent article. On this point, the establishment of a fund for voluntary contributions to support the assistance to victims and the clearing up of the environment of the states affected could be considered in the conventional framework of the convention in order to strengthen the links of brotherhood, or fraternal links, and links of solidarity among nations. On this point, as some delegations have advocated for the responsibility of nuclear weapon possessing states, the responsibility for damages due to the use and testing of nuclear weapons, my delegation thinks that these states that bear responsibility should be called upon to contribute to this fund. We should also bear in mind, however, that it will be the victims who have paid and will continue to pay the heaviest price of the consequence of the use and the testing of nuclear weapons. The main beneficiaries of this kind of fund should be the citizen of the countries affected, and the states affected should receive it.
Could be used not only to consider the participation of nuclear weapon state, but also to discuss urgent needs or requests of assistance. We also noticed that we have similar view like Switzerland regarding the subpara D, because the language here is almost identical to that of the Ottawa Convention and the CCM. And we agreed with the Swiss proposal to add to the end of this subparagraph in accordance with the agreed rules of procedures to be in line with the two mentioned convention. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Vietnam. Now the delegation of Algeria has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My delegation requested the floor in order to make some important remarks on Article 6 at the moment. After listening to many delegations' proposals on this article, Likewise, my delegation considers this article is an important section within the text of the draft treaty in order to meet the right of victims and remediate the environment from the use or tests of nuclear weapons. As many delegations made reference to nuclear weapon testing in my country, as well as in other countries, my delegations would like to underscore that 7 open-air nuclear tests were conducted on the soil of Algeria in the past. We know the negative impact of such evil weapons, and my country is still assessing the injurious effects on the people and the environment. Therefore, my delegation would like to support other delegations which are calling for robust measures, such as in reflecting further responsibilities of nuclear weapon states, not only through meeting or providing assistance to victims, but also through compensations on all levels. We welcome in this regard some measures of compensations taken by some nuclear weapon states. Nevertheless, we consider that such measures are not enough and should be undertaken and treated globally in an equal manner. In this context, we launch an appeal to all nuclear weapon states to cover with this measure all the people and regions that are still and were affected by the use or testing of such deadly weapons. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias a la delegación.
Many thanks to the delegation of Algeria. I now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, President. Excuse me for once again taking the floor on this cluster. There is a specific issue that I forgot to mention when I first took the floor. This pertains to Article 9, subparagraph 4. Indeed, like other delegations, we would prefer wording which differs from that currently in this paragraph. Here we talk about may be invited. Organisations may be invited. Article 9, paragraph 4. May be invited. Who are you talking about? Who, which session, when? Perhaps this language is not clear enough. It's not the most appropriate wording. Perhaps will be, shall be invited would be more direct and more appropriate language. Of course, you can't leave it to the whim of whoever's presiding over the conference to make those decisions. So perhaps Brazil's proposal, Ireland's proposal in this regard, to use the rules of procedure of our meeting, perhaps that's the most appropriate suggestion. We've got a set of rules in place which govern who should be invited where. Moreover, we have rules which determine how non-governmental organisations are able to participate, how they're given that right. Here we talk about relevant non-governmental organisations, but who are they? Who determines whether they're relevant or not? Are they those with consultative status or not? So perhaps we need to clean up this wording to make it clear who is deciding which organisations can attend. So perhaps we can use the rules of procedures of the conference for future states parties meetings. And this brings me back to the frequency of meetings, that issue, of course. My delegation is very flexible when it comes to schedules and when we hold our meetings. Nothing's set in stone. Holding review conferences every 5 years is not something that's set in stone. We could hold them every 4 years. That was proposed by my colleague. We could have them every 6 years. That's what I said. But we shouldn't be tied to traditional positions and shouldn't scrupulously follow other conferences' practices. But what we need to understand is what these conferences are doing, the contributions that they're making, and the authority that they have. You need to look at what they're doing, these conferences, to determine how frequently they should be held. And in that connection, I think that if delegations had that information and looked at that information properly, they could decide how frequently our conferences needed to be held. And they could decide if it was worth having review conferences. This brings me to Article 9, subparagraph 3. Indeed, the language meetings of states parties may decide. There's that phrase there. Which meetings are we talking about here? The last before the States Parties Conference, the first of a cycle, etc., etc. Here, too, I think it would perhaps more useful to avoid...
Important. It is perhaps one of the most important articles in this convention. And there have been some proposals aimed at limiting the number of meetings of states parties or having them less frequently. Well, we would be in favor of having a review and monitoring mechanism that is powerful, that is effective, because this is precisely the mechanism through which we will deepen and enrich the understanding of the convention through implementation and provide greater assistance to implementation. So we agree with the excellent proposal made by Ecuador in that have meetings of states parties every 2 years and review conferences every 6 years. It could also be every 4 years to sort of have the same even numbers in 4 years each, so they would alternate every 2 years. We also agree with the suggestion of Colombia and also the proposal of New Zealand, of course, that the rules of procedure that we are applying in this conference should be the rules of procedure that will apply to the meetings of states parties and the review conferences. It is very important, Madam Chair, that we establish a clear dividing line between this political effort that we are carrying out at this conference and the machinery of disarmament. In other words, I don't like to use this kind of language, but I believe that maintaining that difference, if for example, we would consider establishing red lines in our foreign policy, this would be one of them. And I want to take this opportunity to say that the hope that this delegation has in that we will effectively complete the negotiating work before the 8th of July is based on the fact that the rules of procedure of this conference are not, thank God, are not the rules of the machinery of disarmament. Now, regarding the cost, I would invite delegations that have any doubts on this topic to consider the contribution to the costs of these conferences and, generally speaking, contributions to the implementation of this convention as a demonstration of multilateral leadership. In other words, the effort that we are making has to be supported by the political determination to actually carry it forward, to give it concrete manifestation. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine. But I mean, I think that this we need to have this demonstration of leadership. And I think the text that you have circulated, Madam Chair, is a very reasonable text, as one delegation mentioned. In terms of establishing support structures, it's a fairly light text. I mean, we're not creating a executive secretariat for the convention and so forth. And I am sure that our friends from the Office of Disarmament Affairs, I hope that it will soon become a department of Disarmament Affairs, will be able to provide us support based on the in line with the excellent professional standards that they always demonstrate. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the delegation of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam President, and good afternoon. We have comments on the current drafting of Article 8, subparagraph 2 speaks of the right to seek and receive assistance, and we would suggest that when we look at that language, that we maintain consistency in the way this is formulated with Article 6.2, where we speak of the right to request and receive assistance. I'm aware that a lot of proposals on this article have been made, and there might be redrafting and reshuffling going on at the next stage, but we would be grateful if the consistency of language could be kept in mind. Also, I mentioned it in my previous intervention, we would like to suggest to the room, if it is not useful, to include at the end of Article 8, subparagraph 2, a reference to Article 6. For example, it could read, including with regard to the provisions contained in Article 6. We do recognize that there is a difference in scope between Article 8 and Article 6, but we believe the way that we propose this reference very much takes into account that difference. On Article 9...
assistance for the public services that benefit the victims and for specific projects to clean up the consequences, environmental consequences. This kind of fund could also support the goals of education for peace, as has been underscored by several delegations. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you very much to the delegation of the Holy See. The delegation of Chile, followed by Liechtenstein, has the floor. Delegation of Chile. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a few brief comments regarding these articles. We would like to associate ourselves with the distinguished delegate of Egypt who has proposed adding paragraph 3 in Article 7 to indicate that the state's parties shall submit biennial implementation reports to the meeting of the state's parties. Now, regarding para 2, we listened very carefully the arguments against and in favor of maintaining the reference of imposing the imposition of penal sanctions against those who undertake activities prohibited by the Convention. We would like to underscore that this kind of provision is often can be found in disarmament instruments. And the fact is that since we're looking at a weapon system which is absolutely incompatible and contrary to international humanitarian law, it is illegal, in fact. We believe that the weight of criminal sanctions against those who develop these kinds of weapons that are contrary to the interests of humankind, I think lends weight and credibility to this convention. But we would like to add something else. The fact that this convention is to be incorporated into an international architecture of disarmament, that this convention, as the text indicates, is not at all meant to be at the expense of other instruments such as non-proliferation treaty, but rather as a complement. So I believe that, bearing all that in mind, to add the deterrence or the threat of penal sanctions in a kind of indirect way contributes to this international architecture of disarmament, because whoever conducts activities that contribute to developing, acquiring, using, stockpiling, transferring, or etc. nuclear weapons, well, this provision, this rule will obviously be important and will contribute to international security. We agree with the proposal of Uganda to move Article 8 one article up so that it would follow Article 6. We also agree with a number of delegations that have made interesting comments on this article, in that the implementation of the obligations under the Convention is an obligation for which it's also important to add an aspect of international cooperation. So in other words, not cooperation and assistance for everything that has to do with victims, but also for the purpose of implementing the convention itself. And I want to just recall that this provision, this obligation of international cooperation, and the responsibility to cooperate, as we say in our Chilean foreign policy, it's something that is also enshrined in other disarmament instruments. Now, as far as Article 9, you will recall, Madam Chair, that the delegation of Chile from the very start stated that it sees this convention as a kind of a political construct that will launch a process. In other words, it's a convention that will kind of snowball in its consequences through the process of review and through the process of enhancing the understanding of its provisions, as what happened in the process of review of the Convention on Biological Weapons. The Convention on Biological Weapons is rather brief, but the Conference of the States Parties made it possible to enrich its provisions through implementation of that convention. So we believe that this article is extremely...
At the meeting of States Parties, I'm lucky that I'm speaking after the distinguished ambassador of Chile, who has very eloquently put to the floor why this is a crucial article in the text, and I fully share his assessment. We do need strong and clear provisions in this article, as the meeting of States Parties will be the key political forum to advance the purpose of this treaty. We think we have a very good basis with your draft to do that, and we would like to reinforce it at some points. I recognize that some delegations have referred to the role that the meeting of States Parties will have to, at its constituent meeting to decide on some matters itself, but I think it is very well in the purview of this treaty to give guidance on substantive elements that should be discussed within the meeting of States Parties. In that spirit, we have a couple of comments on paragraph 1. Like others, subparagraph B, we have found that it was unclear what the term reports by States Parties refers to, and it's been mentioned by other delegations. From our point of view, unless it is specified somewhere in the treaty, we would question its introduction here, at least the way that it is framed. At the same time, we believe the meeting of States Parties should have a role to deal with questions regarding compliance with the treaty, and we would therefore propose the introduction of a subparagraph B bis, which would address this issue, and it would read B bis, situations of non-compliance, partial compliance or violations of treaty obligations, and measures to address these. This is just a proposal, and we're flexible to discuss with other delegations the wording of this, but we think the substantive element should be in this text. After subparagraph D, we also have a proposal for 2 additional elements to be included in the substantive issues to be discussed by the meeting of States Parties. D bis, our proposal would be to introduce requests for assistance in accordance with Article 6 and 8, so that the meeting of States Parties can actually take up and react to such requests when they are put forward. And D ter, contribution to the settlement of disputes in accordance with Article 12. When we later come to the Article 12, as it is currently drafted, it foresees a role for the meeting of States Parties to settle disputes, so we feel it's useful to include it also here in this text. On subparagraph 2, we would propose the addition at the very end of the paragraph of the following phrase, or required by a notification of withdrawal. The purpose of this proposal is that should states parties to this treaty or convention be notified by the withdrawal of a state from the treaty. We feel that it is a serious matter of concern to other states parties, and it should be discussed in the framework of a meeting of states parties. Subparagraph 3, we support those delegations who have proposed stronger language in the second line, namely to replace the word may by something more stringent, and I think Ireland proposed it and supported by others also. We would support to have formulation with shall. On the second half of this paragraph, starting with a view to ensuring, we have asked ourselves what the added value of this provision is, and if it's not maybe more straightforward to delete that, since we do not seem to lose anything in substance in this paragraph. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Liechtenstein. I give now the floor to delegation of Vietnam, followed by Algeria, Ecuador, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, RCRC. Delegation of Vietnam has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation, of course, lies itself with the statement made this morning by myself on behalf of the ASEAN. I'm speaking now in my national capacity. And on Article 9, under 1D, we support Cuban proposal to add within agreed time frame. We also share the view of Switzerland about the usefulness of the possibility of special meeting of state parties. And this usefulness could